Story 1, Get your files off my computer. Okay, TLDR, I bought a surplus PC. The HDD had some important looking files on it. The former owner told me to delete them. Later, he needed the files back. The setup: while studying at uni, I crossed paths with a hostile prof, let's call him Professor Nastyman, who absolutely did not want to be questioned about anything during class. Disruptive, he'd say. I'm a researcher with a PhD, he'd say. You're wasting my time, he'd say. Study harder, he'd say. Some of the other things he'd say would likely get this post deleted if I repeated them here. The trigger: I missed a lecture, so just before the next class started, I asked him if I might have a copy of his lecture notes from the class I'd missed. He blew up at me, slammed his papers down and started ripping me a new one, saying that if I was not serious about his class, then I shouldn't be in it and that I should just drop it. This went on until about 5 minutes into the class. Nobody else said a word, and the class continued. Cue the malicious compliance. The uni had a surplus barn where unneeded equipment was palletized and sold at bulk rates. I got there first thing in the morning and spotted a pallet with a bunch of computer junk on it. For $50 US, I ended up with a dot matrix printer, a few 1200 baud modems and an extended technology PC, monitor and keyboard setup. Of course, I also got a receipt. My place wasn't far. So I borrowed a wheelbarrow and brought it all home in 2 trips. The printer was beyond repair. Only 2 of the modems still worked. The PC system booted up on the first try. I looked through the directory and saw what looked like drafts of a research paper and a whole lot of data files as well. The HDD's volume name was the same as Professor Nastyman's, so I rang up his office. His secretary, a sweet grandmotherly type, answered the phone. I explained what I had found. She asked me to hold. A minute or 2 later, Professor Nastyman himself was on the line telling me to get those files off the computer now, sir. Yes, sir, I did it the right way, too. I deleted all the data and document files. Then I overwrote the empty drive space with a huge file full of random bytes of data, deleted the file, and repeated the process 6 more times. Then I reformatted the HDD with a new OS. The PC booted right up to the DOS prompt, and I was happy with my new PC. The fallout: at the next class session, Professor Nastyman greeted me by my name, and politely asked if I had removed the files from my computer yet. Of course, sir. I removed those files from my computer, just like you told me to. Why? Were they important? He told me how important the files were, something to do with 2 or 3 years of research data for a corporate-backed project. Sorry, sir. But you told me to get those files off my computer, so I did. Your secretary and anyone else listening in will verify that. Those files are gone, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. The epilogue: Professor Nastyman had to default on his project, which looked bad for his department and the university as well. Rumors suggested that he had made no backups because he feared plagiarism. I had a few discussions with the dean and some others about this, but it always came down to Professor Nastyman's own carelessness. I finished the class. Got a decent grade, and never saw him again. Story 2, Completely delete a client company's website and email services? Are you sure? Okay, this happened a few years ago, so details are a bit fuzzy and chat is paraphrased. I was T2 tech support for a company that handles my country's largest ISP's entire professional email services, all its DNS management services, and a large portion of its website building and web hosting services. This company is tiny, minute, not even a blip in the radar, but has power that I will likely never again hold at my fingertips. One day, a ticket comes in from ISP. Big client company is moving away from our proprietary email services and into Microsoft 365, or some such equivalent change. This usually meant I got to help the client through the process of changing DNS records, migrating inboxes, or just backing up emails, and even actually setting up some stuff on the Microsoft side. Technically not my job, but the ISP's T1 tech support was woefully untrained for anything even remotely technical, and terribly unprepared for most things merely commercial. And my company was awesome and treated me right. So, ticket, ISP, client is moving from service X to service Y. Please remove their subscription from the database. Me, there seems to be some sort of mistake, which was very common. We remove them from there once the new service is set up and running. Otherwise, it will delete everything in their subscribed package, including all email storage, DNS records, and website. You likely want to change their subscription to not include email services, but keep the rest, since your Microsoft subscription doesn't include DNS and web hosting management. And even that change only after they have their new email service set up. ISP, Udayata confirm remove their subscription. Me, are you absolutely sure? This process is not recoverable. All their emails, DNS records, and entire website, including database, will be permanently deleted. ISP, request has been submitted. Remove subscription. At this point, it's been a couple of days since the first ticket, so I call my boss over, absolutely wonderful guy and extremely intelligent, and tell him what they're asking me to do. Boss, alright, let's show them they pay us because we know things and they don't. Don't delete the subscription, but suspend all the services that would be affected. Keep those tickets at hand and expect a phone call. If they call you, tell them to talk to me. God, that felt good. I mean, I felt bad for the client, because their entire company basically shut down for an afternoon, but when they called my work phone directly from ISP, uncommon, usually just for emergencies, and the nice lady asked me what had happened with client in that tone that says, I'm doing my best to hear all sides before making a decision, but I am freaking the hell out right now. And I directed her to the tickets where I very clearly stated what would happen if I did what they told me to, and then told her to call boss. I felt so vindicated. Boss later told me to let them sweat for a couple of hours, because the process should have been unrecoverable, and then turn the services back on. ISP was, yet again, absolutely thrilled with us, and my name kept coming up even more often as the person that solves things. Story 3, doing exactly what I was told. I used to work as a driver for a freight company. We used to handle awkward-sized items that no other couriers would touch. We delivered everything from coffins to tractor parts. We also had to collect things from our customers for delivery the next day. This company had a mixture of contractors and permanent drivers. I was a relief driver. I knew most of the routes, so I covered holidays or sickness. The management of the depot consisted of a delivery manager and a collection manager. These two people didn't quite see eye to eye, as sometimes getting the stuff delivered conflicted with getting stuff collected. And their targets reflected failures in a bad way. This particular day I had to cover a contractor's route. I didn't know the route, so as we had to load our trucks, this took a little longer than usual. I had around 45 deliveries that day, which is high for this predominantly rural route. I asked my manager, the delivery manager, if he knew the route. He replied that he did and ordered my route for me. So I was good to go, albeit a bit late. I did say that with the volume I had, I may struggle, and I asked him to keep an eye out for me. He said okay. I got to near midday and realized that I wasn't going to be able to complete all the deliveries, and the collections wouldn't get done either. I also noted that one of the collections was off route and the contractor had a vehicle in that area anyway. I called in and spoke to my manager, delivery, and told him he had a choice of collections or deliveries. I also asked why the contractor couldn't cover the off-route collection. I was told to call back later and he'll see if can sort something out. He also said that the off-route collection would have to be done too. I called back later and asked for help again. He said there was no help available. So I gave him the option of deliveries or collections, as there wasn't time to do both. I will get to the time a bit later. He categorically said both had to be done. The delivery manager went home. So I called in again and got the collection manager. She reiterated that there was no help at all. So either I failed the deliveries or failed the collections. If that happened, I'd have been hauled into the office the next day. So cue malicious compliance. I called into one of the collections and I asked what time they closed. 6:30 p.m. they said. So I said I'd be back later. I carried on with the deliveries, which took me further away from that collection. At the appropriate time, I stopped delivering and drove to the collection. I collect 2 small parcels. That was all. I then drove back to where I had stopped and carried on delivering. This cost me about an hour. I finished my last delivery at 7:15 p.m. I had a 45-minute drive back to my yard. As I was leaving the round, I got a frantic call from the collection manager. She was wondering where I was. I told her what had happened and told her that I'd asked for help 4 times and was told I had to do everything allocated, so I did, and it wasn't my fault that it happened like this. Here's where the trouble really started. The company's trunking system is a fluid one. It depends on trucks leaving the depot at a certain time. For our depot, the cutoff time is 7:30 p.m. I wheeled in at just after 8 p.m. There were 15 pissed-off guys on overtime waiting for me to turn up and an articulated truck waiting for these 2 parcels. This wait caused the whole trunking system to be late the next day. My routing was discussed when I got back as it was questionable at best. When I told the collections manager that it was the delivery manager that organized it. There were angry emails between the delivery and collection managers, and I would imagine that the logistics team would have demanded an explanation too. Arses were definitely kicked. The next day no one said a word. I wasn't on that route, and going forward, well, for a little while, they either helped when I asked or didn't get me to do as much. Also, as I had exceeded legal driving time, they had to make sure I went home early for a few days, so a bit of a win there. The biggest trouble these guys had was they always assumed that the drivers were after an easy day, and even when presented with the evidence assumed that you were still trying to be fly. This time it bit them badly. Story 4. Following the process, before I became a manager at another location, I worked in a store and we had a mechanic who had done something which was stupid and against the rules, but it turned into being blown out of all proportion. He was out on a road test in a customer's car after finishing some work, and he stopped off in a shop to buy something. It was against the rules to use customers' cars for personal use, even on a road test. His manager was fairly new to the role, and the mechanic knew he was going to be in trouble but did not think it would be a big deal. As in the past, it would most likely be a telling off as a verbal warning or possibly a written warning. This mechanic was very good, and very productive, and made them lots of money, so they could not afford to get rid of him. However, the new manager decided that he would go all official and hold a full disciplinary meeting. The mechanic asked me if I would act as someone to go in with him, take notes, etc., which was allowed. Beforehand, though, I did try and speak to the manager and suggest this could all be dealt with. However, he said he was following the process and expected everyone to do the same. I then spoke to the mechanic and got the background and what had gone on in the investigation meeting beforehand, which I realized had been mishandled also. The next day there was an office with 2 people from HR who had traveled a long way to this meeting. I said to the mechanic, just go along with it as I indicate. So the HR people and the manager are there, and so are both of us, and the manager starts to go off about what had happened and that he had been seen by the customer stopping off to buy a drink in the local shop. He then went on about rules and procedures, and this went on and on. At the end of it, I asked if we could take a break for a bit, which they agreed to, and then we went back, and to make the point he decided to bring in another mechanic to confirm they knew the policy. Which he said he did, and I said that I could not be sure that everyone did, so one by one they brought each mechanic up and asked them, and also started on did they know what the accused had done, etc., etc. Fully smug at what the manager had proved, I again asked for a break as this had been going on for some time. Of course HR agreed, and I made them wait a goof 20 minutes before we went back. At this point one of the HR people were getting frustrated at the amount of time this was taking and then asked the mechanic, so what do you have to say for yourself? You did know the rules, and you did stop off. Yes, said the mechanic, I know it was wrong and I am sorry for breaking the rules. The HR person looked stunned and said, so why did you say you did not? "I never did," said the mechanic. "At no point did he ask me if I had done it, only that he had to follow the process." At which point the second HR person said, "No one asked you what you had to say about it?" "No, he did not," the mechanic answered. At that point they did not look best pleased. I was trying hard not to laugh at it all. "And look down at my notes," so they could not see my face. The HR person said, "Well, a verbal warning would go on the file, not to do it again, and we could leave the room," and they thanked me for my taking part. We all got up to leave, but they said to the manager to stay behind, and I closed the door, and listened while I could hear them giving the manager a hard time over the waste of time. The next day when the manager run off the productivity report, it was really bad, as all the time lost by the other mechanics while they gave their evidence. I would have loved to see him have to explain that one to his bosses. He avoided HR where possible after that, and never asked me to follow the process again. Story 5, HR payroll manager asked to automate their decisions away. In my first job, I worked in IT as an access and permissions administrator at a large company with significant technological debt. The environment included custom software dating back to the Windows 9X and even DOS era. Initially, the work was quite tedious, involving a lot of back-and-forth communication between multiple departments. We had to ensure that each employee had the necessary training and documentation to access data in the scope requested by their manager. Additionally, we needed approval from the manager of the department related to the system role in question. On top of that, the company's excessive paper-only bureaucratic workflow made the work go at a snail's pace. A single SAP account for a blue-collar worker required at least 3 forms signed by different people. The heads of departments responsible for signing those papers didn't feel any urgency to send them to us quickly. A good example of this is when I, myself, waited over 2 weeks after being hired in the IT department before my first account was set up. Until then I only had a guest account that allowed me to access the main internal website with the company's procedures, regulations, and other basic information. Up to this point each signed form had to be physically delivered to us, which was agonizingly slow given that the company had multiple branches. We decided to automate away the paperwork. Our first step was to allow the use of scanned documents. It was a partial success. While it eliminated the courier delays, management still required us to sign the physical copies afterward, which we mass stamped at the end of each month. The next step was to introduce a fully electronic workflow. We faced significant resistance from upper management, so we had to settle on a system that mostly replicated the existing paper processes. Despite this, it was a game changer. We created presets that managers could select and customize as needed, using data from these customizations to create better-fitting presets. We also developed workflows that automatically generated and assigned sub-tickets for necessary approvals and tracked how long it took, sending reminders if needed. And finally we got an approval from HR to access layoff data to generate user block/removal tickets. Sometime after we rolled out the new system, the HR/payroll manager made a big fuss. She was furious that her team was still waiting weeks to get their permissions and questioned whether all our work had been for nothing. That really struck a chord with me. Inside, I was overjoyed, but I did my best to keep a neutral expression. At that time, we were working on summary reports with burndown and bottleneck charts, and I already knew that tickets requesting HR/payroll access were spending over most of their lifespan waiting for her or one of her sub-managers to approve them. The manager immediately went on the defensive, claiming she couldn't keep up with the amount of tickets. She then requested a change. She wanted any request from her employee to be automatically approved within the relevant scope of their subdepartment. For example, a request for an HR worker to have full HR access and limited payroll access would be automatically approved for HR access but not for payroll, and vice versa. I was skeptical but weren't exactly in a position to argue. I asked my boss to join the discussion and explained that the goal was to prevent overly permissive approvals that could lead to unauthorized access. I tried to convince her to brainstorm together potential edge cases before making a blanket approval, but she was already set on her decision and wasn't interested in discussing details. My boss shrugged and said it would be her responsibility. He told her to write up an official document, outlining the change. And we would proceed with the implementation. The only request we had was to include a line that each such request would still be created, assigned to as normal and marked as automatically approved by name of the main HR/payroll manager, decision. I uploaded the scan into our system and, anticipating that it would eventually backfire, made a photocopy to keep it handy in the top drawer of my desk. The original copy went to the archive. A few weeks later she stormed into our room. The speed with which she flung open the door made it clear she was furious. She demanded to know why we had granted full access to payroll data to her subordinate. I think it was the only time I ever heard anyone yell in the company. I calmly reminded her of her request to automatically approve in-department access requests. She wasn't having it, explaining that one of her low-ranking subordinates from the payroll subdepartment had accessed the salaries of everyone in their department, including managers, and was unhappy with the paycheck disparity. Isn't that obvious that they shouldn't be able to do that? Well, yeah, to a human, but that decision was automated away by your request. I handed her a copy of the document she had signed, which instructed us to automatically approve any and all such tickets without exception. Immediately afterward, she asked us to roll back the change while she wrote up another document to cancel the previous one. In the following days, she meticulously reviewed all those tickets and requested us to reduce access for several users. I have to admit, she did a thorough job and kept up a good pace in reviewing new requests, doing it daily instead of once every week or two as before. In the end, we managed to distill a subset of permissions that could be approved automatically and proceeded to implement a similar approach with other departments. P.S. I don't know whether that payroll employee managed to get the raise, but I'm sure they weren't fired, as we didn't receive any tickets to block or remove any accounts from that department in the following months. Story 6, Who is really watching the clock? Backstory. I used to work in hotels years ago. The hotel I worked at has a policy where there must be at least one staff member at the hotel 24/7. I worked the unenviable but fireproof position of part-time front desk and relief night audit, so I never knew when I was going to be working. 16-hour shifts were uncommon but expected of me when the main night audit called in sick. The story: I had a middle manager who got bored and liked to ruffle feathers for entertainment. Annoying, but I only had to deal with it for 2 to 3 days a week because no one else wants to cover the night audit, so I suck it up and deal. They also love to sleep in and would routinely call in late in the mornings. I really couldn't stand them, but they were my boss, so after giving the essential information and passed the torch from the night audit to the morning manager and crew, I clocked out promptly and got out of the line of fire. So I thought, I get a call waking me up at 11 a.m., because I was sleeping off my graveyard shift that night. I was told to report to the hotel for a disciplinary meeting that includes a middle manager and the general manager of the hotel, my boss's boss. I asked them what the meeting was about and they replied that it was due to my excessive use of overtime. I then asked them if I could come in before my shift that night so that I could actually get some sleep for my next graveyard shift. They replied that I would have to arrive within the hour. Took me 30 minutes to drive to get there, or they would tack on insubordination or some other nonsense to my file as well. I needed the job for rent, so I complied and got to the hotel half asleep. As I am driving, I am trying to figure out how to explain away the nice overtime additions on my paycheck. Took me a solid 10 minutes, but I remembered that the middle manager had yet to actually show up on time for the past month. That wakes me up more and I show up to the meeting absolutely cheerful and smiling, much to the displeasure of the GM and my boss. Boss goes on a tirade about how abusing company time is horrible in many different ways. I no longer have my shit-eating grin, but I am also unfazed by the dressing down and let them blow out their steam that was likely put on them by payroll or HR about how my paychecks were getting too fat for their liking. This is confirmed by a shorter but more professional dressing down by my GM about me costing the company excess money and that I should know better because I run the hotel's books. I calmly state that all of the overtime statements were true and that I would like to compare my punch times to the staffing schedule and the start/end times of the people I was relieving in the evening and who was relieving me in the morning. I explained to them that I was only staying on until the next crew relieved me and I had sufficient time to brief the incoming crew per the corporate policy of the hotel must be manned 24/7. They do and see that there is only a 3 to 5 minute overlap between my shift and the person relieving me. GM looks pissed and middle manager went from smug to looking like they got their hand caught in the cookie jar as their clock-ins showed usually 7-ish and sometimes even 7:30 when their start time was 6. I was then told by the GM that they would reimburse me for the minutes to drive to and from the hotel as well as the duration of the meeting and that the write-up was being dropped in light of new information. Fallout: middle manager still made my life miserable until I left, but at least they never gave me grief about overtime after that and actually started showing up to work at 6 a.m. and not snooze until 7. My paychecks were less, but at least I got more sleep because I was now better able to beat the morning commute at the end of my shift. Edit: I knew my paychecks were coming in hefty for my wage. I never made a stink about staying late because hotels pay maybe 5 cents more than minimum wage if you work graveyard shifts. I kept my mouth shut about my check. I needed that extra cash and dealt with the sleep deprivation for the almost guaranteed additional hour of overtime at the expense of a lazy and petty boss. I had my moment of, how do I save myself, on the way to work and was conveniently able to throw my rabble-rousing manager under the bus in one go.